Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my Victorian literature series, which is all of the Victorian historical fiction and non-fiction that I own. So if you'd like to see part 1, I will link that down below. That is all of the classic Victorian books that I own. So I'll start with the historical fiction books that I own that are set at some point within the Victorian period. So at some point between 1837 and 1900. The first of which is the Gemma Doyle trilogy by Libba Bray, which begins with A Great and Terrible Beauty. This is not only Victorian, it is also young adult, and it is also fantasy, but very much grounded in the true Victorian period. It is the story of Gemma Doyle, who is now orphaned, and so is sent back to England from India, and is sent to a boarding school, where she makes friends with 3 particular girls. And of course I use friends rather loosely as there are some frenemy situations as well. But it soon becomes clear that there's something going on at this school, and there's something supernatural. And it's up to these 4 girls to figure out what it is and what they can do about it. This was an absolutely gripping series when I read it as a teenager. I know that Jean Mingus of the series Jean's Bookish Thoughts loved it when she read it recently in her 20s, so I would highly recommend giving this a read if you haven't just yet. The next book I'm going to recommend is partially set during the Victorian period, and that is Possession by A.S. Byatt. This, I actually came to the film first, which is why I don't mind having the film cover. It is any literature lover's dream. It is primarily the story of 2 literary scholars who are each researching the lives of particular Victorian poets. These poets are, of course, fictional. But in the course of their research, they discover that there may have been a romance between these 2 poets that no one has ever known about. And they are on a race against time and against other scholars to try and dig up the truth, but is something also brewing between the 2 of them. It is such a wonderful book, it is such a wonderful film, and I would highly recommend it. And we, as the readers, get to bounce back and forth between the 2 timelines as they discover more and more about these authors' lives. The next book I would recommend is The Doll Factory by Elizabeth McNeill. This is the story of a young woman who begins life working in a doll factory, but longs to live as a painter. She longs to become a true painter. And she eventually falls in with, I forget if it's the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of painters, or if it's the fictional equivalent of those painters. But while she's going on that journey, Silas is a collector, and he has been watching Iris and decides that she would make the perfect addition to his next collection. It is beautiful, it is gripping, it is creepy, it is thrilling, it is everything you would want, full of Victorian painting and set against the backdrop of the Great Exhibition. It is truly wonderful. Definitely, definitely read it. The next book I have to recommend is The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. This is the novel of Cora Seaborn, who's a young, recently widowed woman who is now that she is freed from her marriage, trying to live her own life, an independent life, with her son, who has some sort of mental disability. I believe he may be on the spectrum, although it's never really named because, of course, the Victorians didn't have the words for such conditions. But she also falls in with the local reverend in the village, and they form a friendship, all set against the magically real backdrop that there could be a huge ancient serpent living in the river. This was gripping, it was wonderful, the characters are so vivid. I remember reading this straight through in 2 or 3 days while I was on a family vacation. And if any of you have ever been on family reunion vacations, you know there are all sorts of things pulling for your time. But it was that gripping that I stuck with it and got through in 2 or 3 days. The next book is definitely young adult, possibly even middle grade. and it is the Sally Lockhart mystery series by Philip Pullman, and the first of which is The Ruby in the Smoke. This is the story of Sally Lockhart, who, again, is recently orphaned and living in London, new to London, who falls in with a ragtag group of friends, while at the same time trying to uncover a theft or a smuggling ring. There are opium dens involved. This, again, I read through in one day when I was a teenager because they are so wonderful, and the whole series is truly brilliant. The characters just come to life and you love each and every one of them, and the Victorian setting is so well done. It's very different to his Dark Materials, but it's just as well written. I would highly recommend these. The next two books were recent reads for me, so I won't say too much about them, but you can search my channel for my more in-depth thoughts. And those were The Poison Thread by Laura Purcell. This is titled The Corset in the UK, which is about a young girl who has the power to sew her emotions into clothing that will then affect the wearer with dire consequences. I also recently read Bellman in Black by Diane Setterfield, about a young boy who kills a rook, and that killing curses him for the rest of his life. The exploration of Victorian mourning in this book is incredible. Definitely worth a read. And the last two books are both by Sarah Waters, the master of Victorian fiction, of Victorian historical fiction, that is. The first is Fingersmith, which is the story of a young girl who is living with a variety of thieves, very Dickensian, think Oliver Twist, and is sent to pull off a heist with this young rich girl who is about to be married to someone that she does not want to marry. The twists in here were incredible. I did not see any of them coming. And again, on vacation, I ripped through this book, and it still sticks with me to this day. The other Victorian book of Sarah Waters that I've absolutely loved is Tipping the Velvet. It was the first of hers that I read, which is the story of a young oyster girl who falls in love with a masher, a girl who dressed as a young boy and sang on the music hall stage, and the story of their relationship and their lives as they go to London and the effects that fame has on each of them. It is a wonderful relationship of the LGBTQ scene in Victorian London, and again, the characters are so memorable and the plot is so gripping. They are wonderful books. I recommend both of these Sarah Waters books. If, however, you're in the mood for some Victorian non-fiction, I have a couple of suggestions. These suggestions go from more sedate to slightly more exciting. There we are, exciting. The first book is a highly unknown book. It is Charles Dickens in Love by Robert Garnett. Robert Garnett was one of my professors at Gettysburg College. His classes were wonderful, and so is this book. It is part biography, looking at Charles Dickens and all of the various women in his life, but it then also compares those relationships to the female characters and the relationships that he writes about in all of his novels, and how his life may or may not have influenced those relationships and those characters. I found this really fascinating, and again, it is highly underrated, so if you can get your hands on a copy, please do, and support Professor Garnett and learn more about Dickens. The next book is Lucy Worsley's biography of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was a complicated woman, and she lived for a long time, so a lot of biographies of her can be absolute doorstops and really difficult to get through. But this book is succinct, it is interesting, and it holds your attention all the way through, because Lucy Worsley is a fantastic writer and a fantastic historian. And the next book I would mention is part nonfiction, part comedy, which is Unmentionable by Teresa O'Neill, which is a guide to sex, marriage, and manners, but absolutely tongue-in-cheek. I laughed from beginning to end, but the facts themselves are very well researched. The chapter titles alone give you a great insight into how this book is written. The introduction is called Hello Slattern. Chapter 1, Getting Dressed, How to Properly Hide Your Shame. Number 3, The Treacherous Art of Bathing. Number 4, Menstruation. You're Doing It Wrong. Courtship, or Not Talking Your Way into His Heart. And number 10, Being a Good Wife. How to Avoid His Eventual Resentment for as long as possible. It is very well researched, as I said, but absolutely hilarious. So if you're in need of a good Victorian giggle, definitely pick this up. In terms of more serious nonfiction, the next book I have is Mrs. Robinsons' Disgrace by Kate Summerscale, which is the history of a very prominent Victorian divorce case and looks at it from all sorts of different angles, and it looks at the Victorian attitudes to women, marriage, sexuality, and how all of those combined to create this explosive divorce case. It was an absolutely fascinating read, and again, rather underrated, so I highly recommend it. The next is a book that has been making the rounds on BookTube, but I still highly recommend it, as I do all of these books, clearly. And it is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which is the story of the 5 known victims of Jack the Ripper, and not just how they were murdered, but looking at their lives up to their deaths and what led them to that point, and how they were not all prostitutes the way they have been painted for many, many years. Hallie Rubenhold is a wonderful historian, so definitely check this book out if you haven't, and check out the rest of her work. And the final 3 books that I would recommend as Victorian nonfiction all go together, and yes, they fall slightly before the 1837 start period, but they still lead the way into the young Victorian era, so I would still recommend them. And those are any books about Anne Lister. If you're familiar with the show Gentleman Jack, then you will love these next couple of books. If you are not familiar with that show, go watch it now. It is still available on HBO, and they are getting ready to film a 2nd season, and I am so excited. But Anne Lister she has been described as the first modern lesbian. She was as out as it was possible to be in the 1820s and 1830s, and she lived an incredible life. She was a self-made businesswoman. She was self-taught in music and languages. She traveled extensively, all of which were incredibly unusual for women at the time. After watching the show Gentleman Jack, I would recommend starting with the book Gentleman Jack, A Biography of Anne Lister by Angela Steidel. This biography lays out all of the events of Anne Lister's life along with all of her relationships in very clear and precise order. I recommend reading this first before you dive into her diaries so that you have all of those characters and all of those relationships sorted out for you beforehand. Afterwards, however, you can read Anne Lister's diaries yourself. This is why we know so much about Anne Lister, because her diaries survived to the present day. They documented almost every single detail of her life. She was an incredibly meticulous diary keeper. And half of them were in code. She created her own code so that she could write about all of her same-sex relationships with no one else knowing what was being written down. And it took 3 rounds of scholars breaking the code before anyone had the courage to publish the decoded versions of her diaries. There are 2 recently published versions. There are The Secret Diaries of Miss Anne Lister. So this version goes from 1816 to 1824. These are both decoded and edited by Helena Whitbread. And the 2nd edition goes from 1824 to 1826, and it is titled No Priest But Love. I would recommend all of these books and the show as a little prelude to the Victorian period. So that is it. Those are finally all of the Victorian books, classics, historical fiction, and nonfiction that I own. Please let me know if you have any other recommendations for me based on what I've told you. Do you have any further questions for me or any inspirations based on what I've told you? Please talk to me in the comments down below. I love chatting with all of you. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.